The reading this morning is taken from John chapter 21, and it's the whole of the chapter from verses 1 to 25. If you want to follow it in the church Bibles, it's on page 1100, 1100. Jesus and the miraculous catch of fish. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there, with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Great. The recreation story, a new start. The before and after theme seems to be all about improvement. It's about plastic surgery or orthodontics or weight loss or hairstyles or makeup or acne cures or Photoshop or hair transplants or decluttering or Botox or orthodontics. The list goes on. I said orthodontics twice, didn't I? Not once did I see before and after having children, before and after the menopause, or before and after a night on the town. The creation story itself, way back when, is presented as a before and after. Genesis 1:1-3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth, before, was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. That's your after. Today's passage also seems to have a lot to do with before and after comparisons. We're directed by John, the gospel writer, to Peter, and it's more of a before and after that, and then after that story. And that's not including the then after that part, which is recorded in Acts. Peter was a fisherman, then he was a disciple, then he was a disappointment, at least to himself, and then he was a redeemed and appointed apostle. John points us to Jesus' sense of the poetic and symbolic in this chapter, highlighting all sorts of echoes along the way. It's a bit of a remember when passage. And there are 4 key points in John 21 when we may say, remember when. Firstly, remember when the disciples went fishing but caught nothing and then brought in a miraculous haul by following Jesus' instructions. Or what about this one? Remember when Jesus fed 5,000 plus with bread and fish that seemed to come out of nowhere? Remember when Peter denied Jesus 3 times? And finally, remember when Jesus called the disciples by saying, "Follow me." Jesus had shown them all these things in the years before, but here he brings them to a crescendo to build them upon each other and produce a rousing finale, a commission beyond anything anyone had ever been asked to do before, to follow Jesus, to follow that. Let's take a very rapid look at the signs that we've studied over the last few weeks, the building blocks we've been provided with, and find out what they have in common, or at least one thing that they have in common, which is the message, you don't need that. Water into wine? You don't need wine to serve wine. The healing of the official's son? You don't need Jesus to conform to your ideas. The healing of the paralyzed man? You don't need to be restricted by tradition. Feeding 5,000. You don't need a year's salary to feed 5,000 people. The healing of the man born blind. You don't need eyesight in order to see. The raising of Lazarus. You don't need Jesus to get there sooner. Jesus' resurrection. You don't need to understand it for it to be true. And today, Peter is about to learn that you don't need to be perfect to be commissioned by Jesus. You don't need your own strength. Just as in all those lessons over the past few weeks, what you do need is Jesus. If we go back over those stories again, we see what and how Jesus gives in each of these situations. Water into wine, Jesus gives the best, Healing the official's son, Jesus gives in his time. Healing the paralysed man, Jesus gives with grace. Feeding 5,000 plus, Jesus gives abundantly. Healing a paralysed man, Jesus gives spiritual sight. Raising Lazarus, Jesus gives life. Jesus' resurrection, Jesus gives himself. And in this reading, Jesus gives responsibility. He believes in us. So let's walk more slowly through this chapter to find out how Jesus asks, remember when, in order to teach and reveal some important truths. Let's do what the writer of Genesis did and start with a sentence to describe the before, just as a reminder. Now, Peter was ashamed and anxious. He had denied Jesus 3 times before his crucifixion, and the Lord had not yet addressed this betrayal. Peter's heartbreak followed him like a cloud. Okay, it's not exactly in the style of the passage, but hopefully you get my point. This event happens when 7 of the 12 apostles are together. 7 represents perfection and completeness in the Bible, and so we can conclude that this situation represented some kind of completion concerning the appearances of Jesus. But in addition to this, there's a practical reason for there being 7 of the apostles present at that time, and that was that a testament had to have 7 witnesses by Roman law in order for it to be valid. So, spiritually, the number emphasises a completion, but practically and legally, the number of witnesses means that the testament of these witnesses can and should be believed. The disciples give us our first before and after when they go out fishing. This had been the trade of at least 4 of them, if not all 7, prior to their 3-year practical training course on being disciples of Jesus. They returned to their original business while they waited to be directed further by their teacher and Lord, far from sitting around twiddling their thumbs, because we don't do fishing anymore, we do God's work. No. They did what they could, and they expected to provide for themselves. However, just like 3 years before, they could not catch anything. The last time they had officially fished, or fished officially, they'd had the same problem. And so John is foreshadowing that something big was about to happen. Before, no fish. After, 153 fish. By the way, this number, 153, is also significant in its own way. If you've ever read Watership Down by Richard Adams, you'll know that any number above 4 was called rare, or fiver. Or perhaps Blackadder's baldric of the Elizabethan age is more your thing, where any number above 3 is son. Here we find a similar term. The number 153 was used to express an unknown, very large number. Maybe they caught exactly 153 fish, but maybe they're simply referring to our term, countless, or the Yorkshire term, shed loads, to put it politely. To which the response has to be, how much? Anyway, remember, our big change, the ingredient that changes the before to the after, is Jesus. Fishing on their own led to 0 fish. Fishing on Jesus' instruction led to shed loads of fish. Before Jesus, they were fishermen. After Jesus came into their lives, they were fishers of men. Jesus stood on the shore, John tells us. But the disciples did not realise that it was Jesus, and here the ingredient is subtly different. The before Jesus was born in human flesh, and that was how the fishers of men knew him. Now he had returned with a resurrection body. Things were a little different, and if you're not expecting different, it's harder to see. In fact, it's the catch, it seems, that makes him recognisable. Just as Mary didn't recognise Jesus, but she recognised his voice when he said her name, John sees the catch and says to Peter, "It's the Lord." And Peter, being Peter, is desperate to talk to Jesus first, to show his enthusiasm, to clear the air. Before he gave his life for us, an earthly body. After he gave his life for us, a resurrection body. And so are we promised a resurrection body. No longer our fallible bodies, subject to pain, viruses, fatigue, bacterial infections, deterioration and more, but instead we will be reborn with bodies fit for heaven. Another side note, worthy of our attention, is that Jesus makes an abundant meal of bread and fish, seemingly out of nowhere. Those fish came when they'd spent all night fishing, and nobody mentions where the bread came from. Remember that? We covered that before? Jesus gives abundantly, just as he did when he fed 5,000 plus, or rather, the 153. Now, here it comes. The new start. Or to be more correct, the new start. The big before and after story. As Jesus asks Simon, as he's referred to here, in his original birth name, whether or not he loves him, he's saying, remember when you said you didn't know me? And 3 times denied means 3 times reconfirmed. In biblical numerology, the significance of the number 3 is in its representation of harmony, God's presence, and completeness, although apparently it's not as complete as 7. Peter would have recognised its meaning in the prophecy, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times in Matthew 26. 1 could be excused. Twice would be embarrassing, but 3 times is catastrophic. A complete and utter denial of his association with the Messiah, his Lord and his God. So 3 times Jesus asks him, do you love me? No. Actually, Jesus twice asks, do you keep a kindness for me? He uses the term agapas. Both times, Peter replies not with, yes, I do, but with, I love you dearly. On the 3rd occasion, Jesus changes the question so that it's in sync with Peter's submission. He uses the term philous, pardon my ancient Greek, asking, do you love me dearly? And Peter is hurt, it said in verse 17. The King James Version says grieved, and the Wycliffe Bible uses the word heavy, referring to how sorry, heavy-hearted. He knew, even though Jesus hadn't exactly mentioned it, that he was referring to the denial. Remember when Peter denied even knowing who Jesus was. Jesus was tackling the crushing weight Peter had been carrying for days. And as with all of our crushing weights, he wanted to take it away. That's not to say it would be like it had never happened. It would be more like what had been a reason for heartbreak would become a testimony to celebrate. Peter's before and after is this. Before, he was trying to do everything in his own strength. After, he recognises that he simply isn't good enough on his own. It takes that all-important difference, Jesus. And Jesus wasn't going to stop there. Where Peter had blown it, he'd failed in everything he'd spent the last 3 years working towards, Jesus not only relieved him of the burden borne through sin by doing the whole 3 times thing, he also commissioned him 3 times. Feed my lambs. Nourish the young and weak in faith. Take care of my sheep. Protect and provide practically for those more mature in faith. Feed my sheep. Nourish those mature believers as well. And we already know what the ultimate nourishment is. The bread of life. So before, Peter was a failure. After, he was the good shepherd's shepherd. I'm going to skip ahead to verse 19, where Jesus commands Peter with the 4th echo, the 4th remember when. Then he said to him, follow me. Remember? Matthew 4:19, come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Matthew 9:9, follow me, and Matthew got up and followed him. John 10:27, my sheep know my voice and they follow me. Matthew 19:16-21 includes Jesus told him to sell his possessions and give to the poor, then come follow me. I'm speeding up because there's loads. Matthew 8:22, follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. Matthew 16:24, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. John 1:43, he found Philip and said to him, follow me. John 8:21, whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. John 12:26, if anyone serves me, he must follow me. And John 13:36, where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow after. It would be reasonable to assume that Peter had heard all of these instances, but if he didn't, I'm pretty sure that he will have known about them. So follow me means to make Jesus your life's work, priority, and meaning. But it also means you're alive. You're not one of the dead left to bury their own dead, and that you have the light of life. And those meanings apply to following Jesus today, just as they did for Peter. Matthew Henry, one of the great Bible commentators, suggests that the call of Jesus, follow me, when said to Peter in verse 19, is multifaceted with 4 meanings. It was a repeat of the first call in Matthew 4:19 and symbolised a restoration in their relationship. But also, it meant stick to my rules and my examples, like following the instruction manual. Thirdly, it meant do as I have done. I've raised the dead, healed the sick, demonstrated the truth of the law, taught crowds. I've even gone head to head with the Pharisees and won. Be excited, because you're going to do that too. And fourthly, it meant you too will die because of me. You will be misunderstood, quashed, and crucified. You will be stamped out because they think that will destroy the truth, but it won't. Notice that the prophecy that Peter would become a martyr is part of his blessing. As painful and difficult as the physical element would be, spiritually, the role of a martyr is a privilege, since it follows Christ in the most complete way. Don't get me wrong. I think it's much easier to think, say, and even believe that as a hypothetical, but there it is. I believe it to be true, but I doubt I would look forward to it. So, before, Peter didn't even manage to successfully follow Jesus into the courtyard. Apparently, John had to smuggle him in. After, he would follow him in his ministry and his ultimate sacrifice. Just to follow another brief tangent, Matthew Henry has some wonderful words on this particular aspect of the passage, not particularly martyrdom, but the physical death that we ultimately face. It is appointed to each what death he shall die, whether natural or violent, slow or sudden, easy or painful. God has determined which way he should go. It is the great concern of every good man, whatever death he dies, to glorify God in it. When we die patiently, submitting to the will of God, die cheerfully, rejoicing in the hope of the glory of God, and die usefully, witnessing to the truth and goodness of our faith, and encourage others, we glorify God in dying, and this is the earnest expectation and hope of all Christians. Although I'm not going to speak any further on that today, it was too good not to share. So, how does this crescendo and finale affect us? And how are we like Peter? Well, firstly, Peter's story is a clear indication of what it looks like to be forgiven through and by Christ. Peter screwed up completely. And yet, when Jesus saw and heard his acknowledgement of his sin, you know all things, and his pain in bearing it, he took it away and replaced it with honour. Peter had shown all the outward signs of being sorry, but what mattered to Jesus was whether or not Peter had love for him. Peter's ultimate before and after was the difference that forgiveness makes. When we love Jesus dearly, he does so much more than forgive us, even though that would be more than we deserve. He gives us this incredible responsibility. This was not just for Peter, it's the commission for all disciples, even us. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be almost perfect. You don't need to have a great track record. You don't need to balance your mistakes out with good deeds. It's not the repentance, although that is an essential byproduct. It's the love. If Peter hadn't loved Jesus dearly, he would not have recognized how he betrayed Jesus as he did. If Jesus had not loved Peter dearly, he would not have forgiven him, and he certainly would not have given him that precious responsibility. So what about us? Where is each one of us in our before and after timeline? Are you still trying to do it all in your own strength? If so, take a closer look at Peter. He'd be the first to say, take a look at me, learn from my mistake. Peter tried in his own strength, and look where it got him, even further from where he wanted to be than when he started. No, the best way to be faithful to God is to use his strength alone. It's a bit like charging a piece of electronic equipment. There's the power, that's God. I'm pointing at the socket over there. Sockets all over the place. And then there's the gadget. I can put my finger on the socket and my finger in the charging point. Nothing effective will happen. And if I try really hard and put a finger in the socket and I put a finger in the charging point, I'd probably end up with an electric shock, or at the very least, and I'd quite possibly damage the equipment. But if I follow the manufacturer's instructions and use the cable I was given when I signed up for all this gadgetry, it works exactly as it should. My vital role is not to be the cable, it's plugging it in. So we learn from Peter, firstly, to use God's strength in order to serve him. And secondly, that there are as many after that as we need. In fact, as far as that's concerned, our ticket, which is freely given to us, is simply to love him dearly. Before our own strength, which fails. I'm sorry, but it's true. After God's strength in us, which always succeeds, even though we can find it difficult to guess what God's success will look like. So is Jesus saying to you, follow me? Is it the first time, or is this a fresh start? Is he saying, remember when I called you? Or maybe he hasn't yet called you to follow him. Maybe he's quietly asking you whether you love him or not. It's not a trick question. Peter had been with Jesus and many other disciples for years. It didn't stop him from mucking up, nor does it stop us. Peter said to Jesus, you know all things. When Jesus asks, it's not because he doesn't know. It's because a relationship in need of repair has to go through an open process of honest reflection. And if that's where you are, take heart. Peter, the very rock on which the Lion of Judah built his church, still had to go through that process. And if you're like Peter when he was still called Simon in his ultimate before, Jesus may be calling you to follow him for the very first time. Follow. Find out what adventure lies ahead. He only gives good things, but they're the real good, not the world's poor attempts. You probably won't find what you're expecting. It'll be much better than that. Before we go into a time of reflection and response, I'd like to just draw your attention back to that list of signs that show us who Jesus is. Jesus gives the best. Jesus gives in his time. Jesus gives with grace. Jesus gives abundantly. Jesus gives spiritual sight. Jesus gives life. Jesus gives himself. Jesus gives responsibility. he believes in us. They show us that Jesus gives.